morning and welcome to another episode of Sephardic U Presents, where we explore the weekly Torah portion through the lens of meaning, tradition, and relevance. I'm your host, Nathaniel Poole.
And I'm Sam Bendayan, your co-host. This week's Parashat Bemidbar, and if you're expecting a dry head count, think again.
Exactly. This parasha is not just the beginning of a book, the book of Numbers. It's the beginning of divine order emerging from wilderness chaos. And what's wild, this parasha always falls before Shavuot, the giving of the Torah, and that's not by accident. So let's go into our first segment here. Chaos needs order. Let's set the scene. The Israelites are in the desert, post-Sinai, post-golden calf, a nation full of people, potential, and passion, but also confusion, trauma, and disorder.
Now, what does God do at this point? Not thunder or miracles. Instead, he says, count them. Assign each person to their tribe, place each tribe around the Mishkan, give every individual and every group their place.
I love how it's so detailed in this parashat, and it shows that before you can receive the Torah, we talked about this last week, before you can receive the Torah, you need structure. The Torah can't enter a soul or a nation that's disorganized, either physically or spiritually.
Right, and this is actually something, there's a point from the Kabbalah here, which is that this world is partly physical, partly spiritual. So the structure comes on the physical side. And so, for
Mm-hmm.
example, if you want to receive God's blessing, let's say, for example, that it's raining and you want to receive the blessing of the rainwater, you need a vessel. You need to grab something, right? Some structure, a glass or a pan or whatever, and you need to hold it out. And if you don't do that, you will not receive the blessing. So the structure is part of the whole um, plan in the universe.
Yeah.
So, so now this begs an interesting question to all of us, in our audience and us as well. Uh, what does your life look like, right? How is your life structured? Uh, what area of your life feels like a desert or an area that could benefit from some sacred order, right? And you can drop it in the chat. You can raise your hand and comment. Either way, I know that while they're dropping their responses in my case, there's always, I tend to be a chaotic person. So it, most of my life has been spent trying to get my energy organized and structured and focused in a certain direction because it just kind of tends to go all over the place. And so right now it's, focused really around work, family, and religion, I would say. Uh, you know, Obviously
Well,
Torah and Judaism.
that's very honest of you. I appreciate it. For me, what causes chaos is not having structure. So I don't know if it's being a Virgo or what, but for me, I have to have that structure and routine, or else I'm I'm out of sorts. So my desert would be anywhere I step into that's disorganized.
Right. And it's interesting how if you look at, even if you look at famous people, you look at artists, for instance, whether it's musicians or painters or whatever,
Mm-hmm.
these people tend to be much less comfortable with structure and they tend to be kind of, you know, out there in outer space somewhere coming up with their ideas and whatever. And so you see that they operate in a world of chaos but often it's too much chaos and it bleeds over into their lives and it makes their lives a disaster.
I
And
don't
then
know. Maybe it's chaos to us from our view, but from them, it's freedom of this creativity. That's why they can make such beautiful music or such beautiful paintings that impress upon us.
Right.
So they don't see their lives as chaos necessarily, though I agree with you. I would. I can't just, hey, let's go out into the woods and write poetry.
Right. Well, I mean, there's many cases where, they have problems, right? A lot of artists, especially modern day musicians, have drug problems, for instance, or they don't have, their families are a mess because they're always, in their
Yeah,
doing
could
their
be.
thing.
Could
And
be.
so you see how the chaos bleeds over, and yet the chaos seems to be a prerequisite for creating things that are extraordinary. So it's almost like there's excellence and extraordinary things in chaos that we have to bring down, but we can't just go in there, right? We are also physical, so we need structure. So we have to strike a balance.
Well,
And
here's an interesting analogy. I just thought Bemidbar means what? It's this parsha. It means wilderness, right?
in the desert,
Wilderness you kind of think of as chaos, unknown, unstructured, but
right?
yet it's all about structure. The whole parasha of wilderness is numbers.
Right.
These
And
are the tribes. These are the head counts, and this is where you'll be positioned around the Mishkan. So maybe you need both. It's that balance
yeah,
of structure
absolutely.
within a wilderness.
Yeah, absolutely. If you have too much structure and not any chaos, then I believe you start to get close to death. Right? I
Mm,
mean, for example, I see something that's always shocked me since, as you all probably have heard me say 100 times, I moved to the US when I was young, and people here were much more structured and orderly. So, of course, you tend to see the ones in the extreme of that. You walk into their house and everything is immaculate and you can't touch anything, and they get offended if you touch anything. And of course, by God, they don't like children because children are always running around and making a mess. And so what happens? They grow old, they have no children, and they die, and that's the end of everything.
well,
So,
that's certainly one example. I'd like to open it up to everybody else here too.
Well, I believe that from the moment of Bereshit, God creates there is tohu bohu, which is the chaos. And God does not want that chaos. And he puts immediately an order. We have the seder, which is an order. The
Mm-hmm.
siddur, we arrange our prayers. There is an order. So I believe that the chaos is antithetical to the Torah's
Very good point. It's also why
foundation.
we
Because
have to pray 3 times a day.
from the very moment tohu bohu is to be eliminated.
Mm-hmm.
but yet we see in life, though, there's a pattern, right? First there's chaos, then you bring it order. Order represents an advancement. With order, you can start doing many things. It makes things a lot better. But once you start to get things too much in order, then you need to break out of that, introduce a little chaos, and then reorganize it again. And this is how you advance. So how many times, nowadays we hear about get out of your comfort zone, you know, learn something new. And so what's this about? Well, once you've got your life all, tidy and in order, you need to break out of that a little bit and then reorganize it. So there's a pattern. Chaos, then
Become
order,
too
chaos, then
rigid.
order. Right,
Well,
exactly.
when we opened the Holy Ark, we said, Hadesh, Hadesh, Yamenu Kekedem. Every day is a renewal, just as God renews nature. So are we supposed to be renewed? God has taken into consideration this part of chaos that is in our existence.
Absolutely. And I think if we're very honest with ourselves and we look at the Jewish people have an enormous amount of chaos inside of ourselves. The chaos, the genius, it's all there. What we
Mm-hmm.
need is structure, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yes,
Structure in order to for us to really advance. If you don't have the structure, we tend to wallow in this chaos and things tend to go down. And so this explains why is it that the Jews have always had to live, throughout the diaspora in somebody else's country. And they have to be beholden to someone else's structure. And yet we see that in many of those cases we flourished. Because once we got into the structure, okay, we got the structure, now we start moving it forward. And once the Jews leave a country, like they did in Spain and Portugal in the Inquisitions, for example, the country stagnates. It just sits there, it's in order, but it's just dead, right? Because now the Jews have left and all the chaos has gone with them. And so the chaos and the genius and the advancement. So it's the whole thing's very interesting. And nowadays we see the state of Israel. And what happens in the state of Israel? It's constant chaos, right? And so this is, I think, the challenge of our time as Jews is being able to bring order onto ourselves instead of having the goyim and the diaspora do it for us. So what do you think about that?
There's legitimacy to all of what you're saying as well.
Yeah, so we see, and of course we see the war now, since October 7th. Anyone who's lived in Israel, you know that the level of chaos there is much higher. The speed at which things happen, everyone is always running around super fast and everything, but are they moving forward or are they running around in circles really fast is the question, right?
Yeah.
So we need some kind of a balance in between the two in order to have progress. So all
Well,
of this
let's
from
talk more about this structure and the camp, for instance, as a metaphor.
yep,
So here's something fascinating. The camp isn't random. The Mishkan is at the center.
Mhm,
Around it are the Leviim,
mhm,
and then around them, the 12 tribes divided into four groups of three, right?
mhm,
And everybody has its place. As we were reading through the parashat and going over which tribes had which duties for the setting up of the Mishkan, I kept thinking like so similar to today rock star, for instance, and their roadies. Here's one group that is in charge of setting up the stage. Here's one group with the instruments. Here's this. And that was so there was consistency, which probably eliminated chaos or potential chaos because the same person or same group doing the same tasks every time they moved, the same people that were guarding over it, the same people that were leading the sanctuary portion of it. So it's very interesting to me. And it's amazing how many parashot refer back to the Mishkan. You
yeah,
It
realize
is,
that? Go
yeah.
on. Sorry.
It is to focus us. That was the main thing. We had
Right.
a physical point of focus because God knows our minds err and our minds wander.
right.
That Mishkan, which was in the middle of the camp, was a reminder at all times that of the presence of God.
Mm-hmm.
Right, and I find it interesting that it was set up kind of like a concentric circle. So you had on the center, you had the Mishkan, and then you had the Leviim in a certain order around the four sides of the Mishkan, and you had the 12 tribes in their order around that. So it was like a big square. It was more not circles, more it was like concentric squares.
Mm-hmm.
You had the all the tribes around, and then the Leviim in a
Right,
square in a circle, and then the Mishkan, which also was a square or a rectangle in the
right.
center. Um,
It was a square. It was a perfect square of 10 cubits by 10 cubits. Everything was perfectly aligned.
And it's all mobile.
Right.
yeah, everything more, right? It's interesting, the desert life, right? Which why do you have to be mobile again? Because you cannot stay in any one place in the desert. There's nothing there. So you're forced to move. And interesting how when we came up with agriculture, this is when we were able to stop moving and put a permanent structure in place. And,
Mm-hmm.
almost as if, not by chance, what is it that Israel has done with the desert? They've actually made it bloom. And they're
Absolutely
actually getting rid of the desert and
true.
putting this structure in place where you can have cities and you can have people living kind of a more sedentary life. So,
Imagine if our lives look like that, where the Torah is the center, our spiritual life right next to it, and everything else is built around that.
Mm-hmm.
right, and I think that that's really the lesson of the Torah is that that's how it should be. Now, that doesn't
Mm-hmm.
mean that you spend more time in religion or in Torah. As Hashem says, you work 6 days, you rest one.
Mm-hmm.
It also says that you have to have the Torah on your lips every day, but the Torah
Mm-hmm.
is something that gives you direction during a life spent doing something else, right? Whatever your profession is. So, and also the Rabbanim have said, uh, it's not a good thing to just study Torah, right? You have to have a balance, right? You have to have
Absolutely
a worldly
right.
profession and then Torah, because these two things feed off of each other. You'll see the utility of Torah in your profession, and then vice versa. You'll see how your
Right.
profession can help you learn Torah as well. And so,
It's yeah.
sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
No,
Sorry.
I was just going to say that those who study only Torah are they tend to get into their heads too much, and they start getting into these fantasy worlds which are not regulated by outside reality.
Mm-hmm.
That's why you have the saying, the rabbi said, "En lehem en Torah." Without bread, your Torah is worthless. They wanted that balance, and that is why the institution of Shahrit, Minha, and Arbit. 3 times a day, we had again to be refocused on God. And the beauty of the holiday it is Mo'adeh Adonai. They are appointed. It is more than appointed. You are meeting with God. Everything, the season, God has created the seasons, and within the seasons we have the 24 hours, and it is Mo'adeh. It was the tent of meeting. The sanctuary was called the tent of meeting. At all times, we are engaged to meet with God.
Right.
That is the time. Time in Judaism is holy because it is Mo'adeh Adonai. The appointed season of God literally means meeting with God.
Right, and the Shabbat is often referred to as a cathedral or a temple in time,
Right,
right, instead of a physical one. So
right.
here's I guess the next big question for everyone is, if someone looked at the layout of your life, your time, focus, values, what would be at the center? Right? Is it the Torah at the center, or is it somewhere close to the outer edges? And so I think that that's a big question for all of us. And I think probably most of us will answer that it's not as central as it should be, right? And but I think those who find that they depend on it, that they put it at the center and depend on it, those will find uh, many rewards, right? And not just financial, but also just your bitachon, your security, your faith in Hashem. When things go badly in the outer world, when they start to become unstable, as we have now, by the way, in the United States especially, there's a lot of shifting and changing and instability. Um, to know that someone is directing this whole orchestra of the universe,
Mm-hmm.
to really have emunah, to have true faith in this,
Absolutely.
is something that is very settling and very beneficial, and it
Mm-hmm.
keeps you sane, keeps you centered, and it keeps you from falling into many of the modern day trappings. We see how many people are taking, drugs, antidepressants, and all kinds of opioids or whatever because they quote unquote can't handle reality. Well, what does that mean? To me, it just means that they don't have emunah, they don't have the faith, and that's why they need these other things.
Well, the ultimate blessing in Birkat Hamazon, Adonai yevarech et amo b'shalom. God blesses his people with peace. Only having God as the center of your life can you have that peace. You can always
Mhm.
resort to him. He is faithful. He says, I never change. There is a permanence, there is eternity. And we who are finite human beings can only find this comfort in the infinite, that is God.
Right. And I was about to say, you spoke about Birkat Hamazon. There's another phrase, Baruch HaGever Asher Yiftach B'Adonai V'Hayad Ha'Adam Yiftacho.
Nachon.
Blessed is he who puts his security in the hands of Hashem, and
Mhm,
Hashem will be his security.
Yeah.
mhm,
And this is how it is. And so how do you do this? If you simply just sit and contemplate, don't let fear take over, but just contemplate how we have no idea where we came from before this life. We don't know how we got here. While we were young children, we didn't know anything. We had no control over anything. And yet, during all this time, there was a master of the orchestra directing us,
mhm,
bringing
Mhm.
us safely to a point in our lives where we could take over control. And now that we've taken over, we get all neurotic and say, oh my God, if I don't do this, everything's going to fall apart. Well, where were you when you were born? And
Yeah.
before that, or while you were an infant, you weren't even there and everything didn't fall apart. And so if you contemplate on these things, you realize that the current situation you happen to be facing now is no different. The only difference is that you are now seeing much more of what the universe is, and you're scared because you see how big it is and the bad things that can happen, but you forget to see the invisible Hashem who's directing everything. And so this is what you have to contemplate on, and this will bring stability to your life.
You see, as we go through every aliyah in this parasha, as we were reading through it, has something to do with the census, the counting, and they're
mhm,
counting and counting numbers.
mhm.
And it dawned on me, why was the census done by tribe and family?
Because they were going to allot the land of Israel. It was important to know exactly how many people there will be for God to determine the size of the tribe and the location of the tribe.
Good, but couldn't they
Plus,
have done that with just one person in charge?
no, because they know nature. That is why, for the first time in the Torah, God is going to address. He says to Moshe Rabbeinu, "Call the heads of the tribes." This way, there will not be, because we are going to see the rebellion of Korah, accusing Moshe Rabbeinu of taking too much power, of giving honor to his own family. God takes into
Mm-hmm.
consideration the human frailties. That is
Right.
why the chief of the tribes are going to be present as they are going to count, and they know exactly what are the numbers of their people. So they are going to be in a position. They are going to try to posit themselves in a favorable uh, status in order to get the
Oh,
best tribe, the best land.
that's right. Later in the desert, you see all these rebellions.
Right.
And
And we also have to look at the size, right? This parasha gives us a very specific idea
Mhm,
of the size involved here. There were 600,000 men of war
mhm,
in Israel. So if you extrapolate it and you say, well, they had wives and children and parents, above the war fighting age, you come up to probably around 3 million people.
absolutely.
And so this is a huge number. And you
Mhm,
see how, Nathaniel, you asked, can you just do it with one man like a dictator on top?
yeah.
The answer is you can't. We see it in the parasha with Yitro when he comes and
mhm,
he gives Moses advice and he says, you can't do this all by yourself. You have to have a structure. So
mhm,
Yitro didn't do it by family, he did it by numbers. He said, tens and fifties and hundreds
Yeah,
and thousands and so on. But you need some kind of a pyramid structure uh, so
exactly.
that everyone else in this huge people can help you carry the load. And in this case, it was done by by tribes and families and such.
Well,
So,
it's to prevent these rebellions, right? Or to avoid disunity.
Mm-hmm.
Because
right,
the greatest danger of the desert wasn't food and water or heat, it was an internal breakdown.
Right.
right. And we see how that's the biggest enemy of civilization. Even today, we see when countries break down, what happens, right? You've got civil wars, you've got military coup. What's
Mhm.
going on there is that there is a breakdown in the trust of the structure of
You're
the
losing your roots.
right. You lose the structure, and so now people say all of a sudden, you know what? That's not my president, or I don't believe in the institutions or
Right.
whatever. What comes next is a breakdown of civilization, and what comes after that is we no longer work together,
Well,
right?
when you lose your roots, you start wandering inside, not out, just outside.
Right. And then if you notice, when we start, civilization really means us working all together. If that breaks down, then each one of us has to survive on his own. Now there's no specialization, which means there's no industry. Everybody has to be a farmer, a hunter-gatherer, his own security, everything. And then the output or yeah, I guess you could say the output or the productivity of the human race as a whole falls drastically. And you start having a society where it's basically subsistence farmers and chaos as opposed to a civilization where people
Mm-hmm.
can focus. I can become a doctor, someone else can become a dentist. And then all of this raises the level of civilization. So this is something extremely important. It's everything that we know in today's life is based on this.
Well, think of it not as a census, but a soul count. And God didn't count us because he didn't know the number. He counted us so we would know that we count.
Right. And it's interesting. And actually, Madame, here's an interesting question for you. There
Mm-hmm.
are times in the Tanakh
Mm-hmm.
where counting is considered a sin, right? There was one case where King
A
David,
sin or a superstition?
no, it was actually he was punished pretty severely for it, where he decided to take a census of his army. And it's not in the Torah, it's in the story of King David.
Right.
And,
But it says the counting according to Rabbi Shammah, the counting was forbidden because it was for two purposes, either to raise taxes or it was to bring people to war.
Hmm.
Therefore, it was avoided.
right, and
That's
it
what,
actually and it's a very peculiar story because it says that Satan moved David to take the census. And
and
then once
his even Joab, who was his chief of staff, refused to take the census because they knew that the populace was going to be worried. Was it going to be raising the taxes or taking count to send them to war? So the census was always had a bad connotation.
very interesting. And then of course we see that he was punished. Well, that's kind of another story, and I don't want to get too far off the topic. But the punishment itself was a very interesting story if you want to look that up. But it's very interesting. In this case, he's commanding a census, but it's not about the counting itself. It's about your purpose behind the counting that really matters. And this is something that I always tell my kids. It's not what you do often, but or if sometimes you're asking yourself, what should I do? And you're not sure and the answer's not in front of you, look at the why. Why would you want to do this or why would you want to do that? And often the answer is found there. And so we see the same thing here. Is census good or bad? Well, neither. It depends on why you want to do it. So in this case, Hashem had a purpose, so obviously it was a good thing. But if King David had another purpose in mind, then all of a sudden it became something bad. So it's not a question of a physical deed is a mitzvah or an averah. It's more nuanced than that. You have to
Mm-hmm.
examine yourself on why you're doing these things.
Well, it's that time again. Thank you, Sam. So as we wrap up, this parasha teaches us that structure creates space for holiness, and every Jew matters, every position matters, every movement through the desert is part of the journey toward destiny. So before we get to Shavuot, we're reminded Torah can only live in a structured environment. And the vessel is order, family, tribe-centered living. So here's your desert homework this week.
Yeah.
Identify one area of your life that feels disordered. Recenter your Mishkan, whether it's Torah learning, tefillah, coming to live minyan, or even a quiet moment with Hashem. And the last thing would be remember that you count. So thank you for joining Sephardic U Presents. You can find the podcast on our YouTube channel and, of course, SephardicU.com, which was just redesigned. And if this inspired you, share it with somebody who's walking through their own wilderness. And until next week, I wish you Shavuot Tov, and thank you for joining us today.
Thanks, everybody. Shavuot Tov.
Shavuot tov. Shavuot tov.
Shavuot Tov.